In recent years, Nigeria has signed trade deals with China and other foreign allies. Federal government's implementation of the Economic Recovery Growth Plan has seen the country up the ladder of ease of doing business ranking.
Well, yes, but one area Nigerians have been asking questions is the refusal, or should we delay in signing the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement? Well, on this front, there are wailers, and you could say also there are hailers. We have joining us from our Abuja studio to discuss Nigeria's trade and investment drive, the Honorable Minister of Industry, Trade and Investment, Okechukwu Enelama. Good morning and thanks for joining us, Honorable Minister.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Great. Let's begin with the Davos that just wrapped in Switzerland. Of course, the Nigerian delegation to Davos made a very strong case for Nigeria's economy. You want to give us high points or highlights of the point you made at Davos?
Again, thank you for having me. Like you said, we had a good outing in Davos. Davos, as you know, is a place where you have a gathering of business leaders, political leaders, and leaders in other parts of society, civil society and all. And we had a range of meetings. Speaking from my perspective, I was part of a meeting of trade ministers where we focused on global trade as well as what it would take to create a win-win set of partnerships in trade. I was also part of a set of meetings that focused on digital economy, e-commerce, and how to leverage technology to build our economies and to help our people. And then we also had a number of bilateral meetings because, like I said, you have a number of people you have a lot of people that actually come to Davos, and many of them are interested in Nigeria or already operating in Nigeria, and we met quite a few of them. And I would say the meetings all went very well. And the key highlight is that, whereas in general, you can see that there are several tensions around the world, whether it's in Europe and Brexit or in the US or China, Africa has its own set of challenges, but there is no question that as we pull together, Africa also has a great potential. And I think we can leverage trade, we can leverage investment, we certainly can leverage industry to move Nigeria and Africa forward.
All right, Nigeria was to sign the Continental Free Trade on the continent of Africa, but eventually pulled out because of some concerns that were raised. Have these concerns been addressed now?
Thank you for bringing this up because it's good to clarify where we are in the process and what brought us to where we are. The African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement is an important landmark agreement that will last for the next 100 years. It's akin to the way you have the European Union set of agreements. And so what happened is that initially the thrust of the agreement and the work on it was led by the what you call the AU Summit, which is basically the African Union heads of government and heads of state. And they were the ones that basically prescribed and directed that an agreement should be signed in March last year, March 2018. However, the plan was that people will sign what you call a heads of agreement or sort of a framework agreement. In other words, you sign the fundamentals or the headlines, right? And then you go into the details, which is what is actually going on now. In the case of Nigeria, following engagement with some of our key stakeholders in manufacturing, the states, and so on, it was agreed that it was better, since it's a long-term agreement, for us to complete some of those early negotiations and understand the impact before we pen our signature on that agreement. And that work, as you know, has gone on, and I believe that work is now wrapping up. And as a result, I think Nigeria is in a much better place because I think all the major stakeholders in industry, in business, the states, and civil society, for that matter, have been carried along. So I think this is an important agreement, and it's good to do it well. So that's where we are.
Yeah, you say that Nigeria is in a good place now to sign that agreement, but you recall that Donald Trump pulled out of NAFTA because he feels that it's not in the best interest of, big nations like the United States. And one could say the same for Nigeria. But what aspects, what are the elements really that Nigeria had reservations about that it would not go ahead with signing as quickly as possible?
Thank you. Again, let me make the point that, and I would like to use your example actually of the U.S. and the NAFTA agreement to make this point that what I understand the president of the U.S., Donald Trump, was saying was that he wanted the agreement between United States and her neighbors to be fair, right? And as you know, they've been renegotiating. And Nigeria is doing exactly the same thing. So I think the principle of having a fair agreement, an equitable agreement, is one that Nigeria clearly supports. In addition, you also raise an important point about understanding the consequences of the agreement. In other words, understanding the implications, what is likely to come out of the agreement. One of the most important dimensions of that agreement is what we call rules of origin. In other words, if you sign an agreement with other African countries, will foreign countries try to exploit less vigilant countries to come and bring in finished goods and discourage manufacturing and say it was actually done in Africa because they land on some country. So a lot of work is going on to understand how we'll enforce those rules of origin to make sure that when we say things are African, they're truly African. The other dimension to it are some of the issues we face back here, issues like smuggling. How do you make sure that smuggling doesn't become a problem if you were to sign an agreement like this? Issues like our infrastructure and basically our own local manufacturing. How do you make sure we position our own players to compete, or better still, to add value in a way that would be good for Africa and be good for Nigeria? The view we took was that it was good to do a lot of that work up front. And I believe that a lot of the work that is going on with the economic recovery and growth plan and with our industrialization plans, taken together, would help us as we think about the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. Let me make one last point. It's also important to understand that this agreement will cover services, and Nigeria excels in services. So whether it's digital economy, whether it's our lawyers, whether it's our bankers, or whether it's all the other services where we are active, they will also benefit from Nigeria being part of a continental agreement. But we have to do it in a proper way.
All right. You revealed at some point that Nigeria recorded $83 billion investment commitment between January of 2017 and first quarter of 2018. I'd like to ask you, how much of this commitment has become a reality?
That's an excellent question. So first, I'm glad you picked up the nuance, or what you might call the difference between investment commitments or announced investments and actual investment flows. Because it turns out that for foreign direct investment, or even what you might call domestic direct investment, that is a local component, people take a long time to plan, particularly if they're dealing with big investments. And I'll give you 3 examples. When we were in China, the president met with the chairman of the Rui Group, which is a big industrial group in China, the leading group when it comes to cotton, textiles, and garments. And they have made a commitment to invest up to $2 billion in Nigeria. But that work has been going on since then. And that work is likely to go on for the next several months before they actually complete the work and then make the investment. I think they will invest in 2019, but clearly a lot of work, all their people have been coming and going, doing all the feasibilities and all the locations, understanding the locations where they would invest. Similarly, you may be aware that when the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, came, Volkswagen came with them and signed a memorandum of understanding with Nigeria. We've also been working with them, and that work continues. And they also want to make a significant investment in Nigeria. And of course, a host of other countries and other companies, that, including those that are existing, that want to increase their investment. I'm sure you probably heard that Coca-Cola just completed an investment in Chi, which is in the juice and beverages area. All these things add up. And the important thing is that, they start with commitments. You cut the investors, you work with them to understand their investment plans, and you support them to invest. And obviously, that's what creates the jobs that we need as well.
But how have you been selling Nigeria to, foreign investors who believe that Nigeria really is a place to invest in, but there's so much uncertainty, political uncertainty and all of that. And of course, the ease of doing business is not looking too good. Nigeria did gain some 24 steps, only to fall back one, where one might say that's not too bad. But how are you convincing foreign investors that Nigeria truly is a place to invest in?
Thank you. I think I'll make a number of points because that's an excellent question, Ngozi. I think the first thing to say is that, like you said, Nigeria is fundamentally, that means basically an attractive investment destination. I mean, the fundamentals are clear. The size of the country, the size of the market, and in many respects, what investors truly care about in terms of doing business, Nigeria actually isn't doing that badly at all. In other words, Nigeria is a country that understands markets and where investors can basically find people who are similarly minded to work with. But having said that, you are right that we can make it a lot easier for them. And it will be a win-win partnership, which is why President Buhari in his administration, focused on the importance of creating a better and an easier environment to do business, what we call an enabling environment to do business. And before President Buhari's government came, Nigeria had been sliding in the World Bank Ease of Doing Business rankings for 10 years. We used to be in the top 100, then we went down all the way to 170. In the first year, we completed the work we did under the Presidential Council he set up, the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council. Nigeria jumped 24 places. Remember, this is like basically outrunning a moving target because every other country is also trying to get better. So I think it was celebrated around the world, and we were considered one of the top 10 reforming countries. As happens in all such things, you need to consolidate your gains. So last year, we didn't do as well, but I believe that going forward, you're going to see increasing momentum and that Nigeria will get better because some of the heavy lifting, some of the hard work that we need to do is going on right now. You probably heard that the National Assembly is just completing work on the new Companies and Allied Matters bill, which will make it a lot easier for companies to operate in Nigeria. That's what businesses are interested in. And that bill, like a number of people have already stated, is a landmark bill because it goes into great detail to remove the bottlenecks that hinder businesses from operating in Nigeria. So I think there is reason for hope. There is reason for optimism. And the final thing I would say is that, we also need to understand that when it comes to selling a country, it's not the government per se that sells a country. That's why it's so important to treat the existing investors well. I think as people who are already doing business in Nigeria are happy and they make good returns, they will sell Nigeria. And it's very important that we continue to, encourage those that are already here, and give them the support they need, which is back to this is of doing business and making it easier for them. Because when we do so, frankly, that's the best marketing, when the customers market the country.
If I may comment, Honorable Minister, a lot of those that are here, so many businesses have been leaving the shores of this country for other countries in the West Africa sub-region. They're going to Ghana, they're going to other countries because the environment just does not conduce to doing business, even for the local investor. There's a tomato puree company that left the shores of this country. What are you doing to even encourage local investors to, to stay?
So I'm glad you asked that question. The interesting thing is that, historically, businesses have left Nigeria. When I say historically, if you go and do the numbers, you'll find that, a lot of the companies that left before this government actually started. And I'm not saying that to defend the point that, we have done as well as we should. The important thing is that, we need to create that enabling environment which this government focused on. It was not a priority for Nigeria before. I think history will record that it was President Buhari and this government that actually acted on making it easier to do business for businesses. And in so doing, I believe that trend is effectively reversed. I think if you go and look at the numbers, you'll find that is no longer the trend. You pointed out that there were investment commitments of over $100 billion in the last 18 months or so. That's what you call a leading indicator. In other words, it tells you where a country is going. And we have never had that level of commitment historically. So I think you will find that in the coming months and years, the turnaround will be effective because the fundamentals, which is basically making it easier to do business, we're now focused on it and we're now working on it. I think you will see that there will be a difference. But historically, going back to 10 years, 5 years ago, there is no question that Nigeria at times was viewed as a difficult place to do business, and we need to reverse that trend going forward, looking ahead.
All right, Honorable Minister, what do you make of the charge by the think tank, the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, that Nigeria, first of all, needs to tackle the slow economic growth because the GDP growth rate declined from 1.9% to 1.5%. That was the first quarter of the first quarter of 2018, and later improved in the third quarter. What do you make of that charge?
Well, I think, let me acknowledge that it's in our overwhelming interest, and it is our overwhelming objective for the economy to grow for several reasons. You know, a growing economy that is done in an inclusive way, which comes back to the economic recovery and growth plan, will create jobs. And we are very much in need of more jobs for our teeming population. So we are definitely committed to that. And when you talk about the economic recovery and growth plan, as you know, it lays out a growth trajectory, a growth trend, which is important, because what's important about growth is that you need to be, trending the right way. You need to be going in the right direction, because over time these things compound. And like you pointed out, when we started, the economy was already moving into a recession and moved into a recession. Mm-hmm. So the economic recovery and growth plan was put in place to reverse that trend. And that reversal has since been done. In other words, that correction has been done. Now is for the growth to pick up. As you know, this year we're projecting between 2.5% and 3% growth. Last year, like you said, it was between just under 2%. And I think that that's the right trend. Clearly, where we are headed is 5 to 10% growth and beyond. But these growth things, particularly when you want to do it in a fundamental way, in an inclusive way, in a sustainable way, it takes time, right? Because you need to do what they call structural reforms. We just talked about one set of structural reforms, which is in the enabling environment. And that set of structural reforms relates to infrastructure. You need to build out the infrastructure, and it takes time to build it, whether it's roads or railway or power, and you know how much we've done already in those areas. But I think as these things come on stream, all this good work this government is doing, the economy will pick up. And then the final thing you need to do in terms of structural reforms is industrialization. We're creating special economic zones. We now have something called the Industrial Policy and Competitiveness Advisory Council, where the private sector, like the Nigerian Economic Summit Group members, and the government meet to understand the critical needs of the country for industrialization. And I think those things taken together will produce the right structural reforms. By structural reforms, we're talking about changing the fundamental structures of an economy so it can absorb more people, employ more people, and grow in a sustainable way.
Earlier, you talked about fundamentals and how you are doing a lot to fix that. And I believe part of the fundamentals would be power. The body you just referred to, Nigeria's Industrial Policy and Competitiveness Advisory Council, was to help add about 4.2 gigawatts to power to the national grid. I wonder how much progress you have achieved in that area, because power continues to remain a major challenge both for the local investor and, of course, the foreign investor.
Again, great question. Let me first of all explain what the Industrial Council is and what it does, right? The Industrial Policy and Competitiveness Advisory Council, like I said, is a council set up by the President and approved by the Cabinet, the Federal Executive Council, to focus on the critical needs of industrialization. What is it that will help Nigeria industrialize? And it's made up of up to 20 members from the private sector, and also ministers, senior ministers, and government or senior government officials, and is chaired by the vice president, who is also the head of the economic team, as you know, and the head or the chairman of the Nigerian Economic Council. Now, the Industrial Council is also engaging the states to deal with issues at the subnational level. There are 6 critical areas where the Industrial Council has been focusing on. You mentioned one, critical infrastructure, and I'll come back to power. Number 2 is also been focusing on vocational training and skills acquisition, which, as you know, is a very important area for creating jobs for our people. It's been focusing on financing, long-term sustainable financing for industry. It's also been focusing on trade and market access. And then finally, it's been focusing on policy, the kind of policy initiatives that will support industrialization. Now, all this work is being done in several work streams, over 40 work streams. One of them is in the area of, or some of them are in the area of power. You just mentioned one. What the Industrial Council is doing is looking at what they call stranded assets in power, which is what you talked about. In the past, Nigeria had invested in some power generation plants and projects, right? But these projects either didn't have gas or didn't have something needed to bring them onto the grid or on stream. So the Industrial Council has taken up the responsibility of trying to fix that. And that's where this 4.2 megawatts or 1,000 megawatts will come from. You know, and what we're really looking for there is basically to ensure that like the things we have already invested in are not wasting assets, which is what we had in the past. Let me also say that if you look at the numbers, before this government came, the actual power that was being supplied, you know, that was actually reaching the customer was about 2,500 megawatts or 2.5 gigawatts. You know, that number has doubled, and the actual number that was being generated was about 4,000 or 5,000. That number has increased by 50% to about 7,000 going to 8,000. And the things in the pipeline that will get on the stream will take us to over 10, 12,000. So in terms of the impact on power, you know, there's no question that we've made a significant impact as a government. My sense, though, is that we should also remember that a lot of the power is in the hands of the private sector in terms of distribution, in terms of power generation. So it's, again, a partnership between the government and the operators in the power sector that will lead to the full delivery of the power needs of the country.
All right, Honorable Minister, Nigeria dropped one notch to 146 on the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business ranking in 2018 after moving up about 24 notches to 145 in 2017. In your view, isn't that a setback for the ministry's business enabling environment pillar? And what is being done by the country to put it back on track?
Thank you for asking that question. You know, first, like I said earlier, we need to put this in perspective, where we are coming from, so we understand where we are going. Where we are coming from is that for 10 years running, before the President Muhammadu Buhari administration, Nigeria was dropping in the rankings. You know, we used to be in the top 100 companies in terms of ease of doing business, and we had dropped to as low as 170. You know, and so the President made the decision to set up the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council to focus on dealing with the various elements or various aspects of ease of doing business that will improve our ease of doing business fundamentally and also hopefully improve the rankings. And fortunately, in the first year of implementation, we improved by 24 places, which is pretty remarkable. And that is why Nigeria was adjudged one of the top 10 reforming countries. As happens in such things, some of those reforms had to be consolidated. In the next year, Nigeria actually improved in what you call the absolute rankings. In other words, if you look at the percentage score of Nigeria, it scored a pass mark. It moved from maybe, 50, early 51 to, a better score. However, in the relative ranking, because this is actually a moving target, other countries are also getting better. Nigeria dropped by a place, like you said. But our target is to get back to the top 100. So we look at it that we consolidated last year. We expect to see a significant move again in 2019. Some of the reasons are they rate things like legislation very highly. And as you know, and as I said earlier, we're just about to pass a Companies and Allied Matters bill that will soon become law. When that law is passed, I believe it will have a huge impact on our rankings. But let me also say that what we are more interested in fundamentally is to make it easier to do business in Nigeria. In other words, we're interested in some of the things that the ranking doesn't even measure. Things like visa on arrival. Things like making it easier for people to enter the country and leave the country. Things like making it easier to operate in our ports. All those things matter. But the rankings only focuses on what happens with small businesses. So I think overall, our focus is to make it easier to do business in Nigeria. And I'll conclude with one thought. You remember that we have something called the Executive Order 001, which is the first executive order that this administration passed. And it's focused on basically government making it easier to receive government services. It has something it has principles of transparency, so people understand how long it takes to get an approval. It has the principles of one government, so that if you need some approval or some certificate from another arm of government, you don't depend on the person or the institution looking for the service to get it. It has the principle of deemed approvals, which means that, if by the time that is given to get a service, it's not received, silence then means agreement, unless there's a reason why the agreement is withheld. Okay. So overall, you will find that we've made some pretty fundamental changes that will continue to produce results for a long time to come.
All right, because we don't have all the time to break down all of those changes, let's move on to other things. The trader money is within the purview of your ministry. A lot of people who have been wondering as to the sense in the trader money have been, giving it some kind of political undertones that, as a matter of fact, is nothing short of vote buying. Since this is happening at a time when the elections are right around the corner, I wonder what you have to say about this, and how really is the trader money doing in changing the lives of petty business persons?
Ngozi, thank you for bringing up this subject, because it came, frankly, for me as a surprise that people could even in any way imply that this could be voter buying, and for several reasons. Let me just deal with three. The first one is that, this government made one of its cardinal and flagship programs, the whole social intervention and social investment program. And it was very upfront and very transparent about what is included in it. This is from 3 years ago, right? And, of course, what is called trader money or market money or the other sort of grants and loans that are given to the poor and the most vulnerable in society is at the very heart of that social intervention program. Just like the lunch program, the feeding program for children in school, and the Empower programs for people coming out of school that you are preparing for work. All these are flagship programs. To anyway imply that when you then implement them, which has been going on for well over a year, when you start implementing them, because an election is coming up, either you should stop or it implies you're buying votes, just sounds to be, stretching, the truth, right, too far. The truth of the matter, and this is where I probably agree that some people ought to be worried, is that it's trader money and market money and so on are enjoying very wide support from the public, from the teeming population. Because, it's an attempt to actually intervene directly in the affairs of the most vulnerable in society. And therefore, it's something that I appreciate. We're getting a lot of good feedback. And clearly, those people will be supportive of the government. So the opposition may well feel that, this is not fair game. But I think they are obviously not right in that, because the government must continue to play the role of governance and helping the people. You can't stop helping the people because an election is coming.
Yeah, but those who criticize that policy, those who criticize this MO are saying if you put that amount of money, the billions involved in trader money, into more sustainable projects, then you would have a situation where you don't give the people fish, but you actually teach them how to fish.
So it's an excellent observation. But remember, we don't have the luxury of what you call either or, right? It's either you help the poor and the needy or you teach them to fish. That's point number one, because you actually need to do both, because the person still needs to eat today. But what's even more important is that trader money and market money is teaching people to fish, not giving them fish. These are people who are trading that need working capital, that need capital to invest. And so when you give them capital, because the people who are wealthy think that what can you do with 10,000? They don't realize that for a petty trader, 10,000 actually helps them to buy stock and to fish, right? So it's actually capacity building. It's not just, they don't use it to buy food to eat for that day. It's not for consumption. It's a form of investment, which is why it's called social investment programs and social intervention programs. So I think Nigerians would do well to be more sensitive to the poor and understand that, frankly, 10,000 can make a difference if it's given in a systematic way, like trader money is doing. And the feedback we're getting is that in any event, it's helping the people to whom the money is applied. And who are we to question the help they're receiving, for which they're exceedingly glad?
All right, let's turn our attention now to the automobile industry. The Nigeria Customs is saying that a 35% levy charged on imported brand new cars should be reduced to 10% because it is encouraging smuggling. What's your take on this, considering that the levy was introduced to discourage imports and grow the automobile industry?
I'm glad you brought this subject up, because it's one that is obviously receiving a lot of attention from us at this time. Remember that this is all part of the broader theme of industrialization and the commitment to trying to add value locally. You may be aware that Nigeria spends billions of dollars, $5 to $10 billion maybe, or something in that region every year, importing all kinds of things that are related to the automobile industry, the cars themselves and the component parts and so on. The question is that what more can we do to encourage local production at a time when we need the jobs? And it turns out that no matter how you cut it, if you want to discourage imports and encourage local production, you have to make a quality decision. You have to make a a deliberate decision to protect those that will produce locally, those that will invest locally. So I remember living in South Africa about 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. When I got there, they had a similar policy. Today, they're almost self-sufficient in car production. But what they did was they raised the tariffs and encouraged and gave incentive to produce locally. So in a nutshell, in very simple terms, what we're trying to do, or what we're doing, is trying to say, for those that want to invest more in Nigeria and produce, we'll make it easier for you. For those that want to import, the imports will be costlier. Now, I agree with you that the policy has not worked out well so far. And the reason is that you need those who you are targeting to make the investment to actually make the investment. Some investment has been made, but not nearly enough, which is why the relationship with the likes of Volkswagen is mission critical. It's extremely important. And I told you that we signed a memorandum of understanding with Volkswagen. And the whole idea is that they can come here and make a signal investment, hundreds of millions of dollars, if not $1 billion, and then produce and then employ thousands, if not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. And the whole idea is that you have to create an enabling environment for them, which includes, raising the barrier for cheap imports, particularly for, the kind of imports that come through the grey market and the smuggling you talked about. The last thing I would say is that we actually need to do something about smuggling. Even if it's at 10%, it doesn't matter the amount you put it at. Unless you discourage smuggling, you would discourage local production. Smuggling is a killer of local industry.
Yes, indeed.
All right. Honorable Minister for Trade, for Industry, Trade and Investment, Okechukwu Enalama, we thank you very much indeed for coming to share thoughts with us on TVC Breakfast.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me, Ike and Ngozi.